And we'll start now with the first presentation. So welcome everyone, I'm Scott Mitchell from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies here at Carleton. I'm very happy to be presenting this webinar today, an overview of the project we've been working on for the last 3 years, and another seminar in about a month where we'll go much more into the details of how we created our data products and tools in case other people are interested in giving this a shot. I want to use this time for this slide to do a couple things. One, to acknowledge all the people that have made this project happen. This isn't all of them. This is a list on the title slide of people that have been involved right from the beginning and done a lot of work to get the project going. So I've introduced myself, but we've also got Livia Bizakova from International Institute for Sustainable Development. Dan McDonald will speak. She'll be speaking later today, so will Dan McDonald from Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And Samsa Hamalainen from the same organization has done a lot of the work on the spatial database underneath this work. Patricia Larkin is online remotely. She's was working as a graduate student from Ottawa at the time. Amadou Thiam is here from MAFRA. He's really helped us figure out what our research questions should be, what our objectives should be, and helped us connect with agricultural communities in the region. Ruth Waldick was my co-primary investigator on this application. She's joining us from BC today. Anna Zaitseva has worked as a research assistant, then a graduate student, now research assistant again, right from the project that precedes this one. Unfortunately, she's got a bad fever today, and if she's feeling well enough later, she'll join remotely, but I'll step in for her. I also want to mention thanks to all of you that have joined remotely. Just a reminder, if you can, keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking to us. There will be times throughout the presentation to have some discussion, and if you want, certainly I'm fine with it. I'll assume the others are fine. If you want to interrupt with a question while a particular slide's up, that's fine too. Obviously, we've played a little bit with the schedule already, starting late, letting people get connected. We'll just have to adjust as we go. For the people in the room, if you didn't already hear me say this, there are microphones placed throughout this room, and they are quite sensitive, so please keep that in mind, that they are on when somebody's up here presenting, so that everybody can hear the person up here, but that also means it can pick up sounds around this room as well. Okay, so what was this project all about? Our objective is to create and deliver information about climate extremes that will affect Ontario agriculture. Both the agriculture sector and the rural communities around it. So I wanted to first start off to make sure it's clear what we mean by extremes. And I'd like everybody to keep in mind that what we're talking about all through today as extremes is not really what people tend to think of as extreme weather, in that it's not just the most dramatic floods and droughts and tornadoes and ice storms, other things that people tend to recognize probably as disasters. In classic climatology, not necessarily the same thing as climate change studies, because that seems to be a more flexible definition, but in climatology, usually extreme weather refers to something that is surprising statistically. So it has specific mathematical definitions to some degree, or at least a lot of the time. But even that, in statistics, everything that's considered surprising just means it goes beyond some kind of threshold in a distribution, which could be argued is somewhat arbitrary as well. And for those reasons, and also because we really wanted to focus on impacts of the extreme weather on specific parts of agricultural and rural operations, we decided to focus on changes that really matter to agriculture in the region that are looking at weather patterns through seasons. So specific events or combination of events, patterns of events that would have significant impacts on agriculture. We know that producers have adapted to the patterns that have experienced in the past, so what we're trying to illuminate here is what are the implications of changes to these patterns, what are the new things that they may have to adapt to. So we've been learning at the same time about the processes that farmers use to adapt to the weather and figuring out how the stresses from climate have been changing and are likely to change in the future. We have been developing decision support tools to try and put this all together. What do we mean by this? We mean tools and data sets that allow analysis that compare the weather that we've been experiencing in the past, the experiences of people that have been working on the land in the region, and different groups' projections of what might happen in the future to figure out what situations are likely in the future and what's that going to mean in terms of getting prepared for those changes. What do we mean by scenario-based? That involves thinking about what some alternative likely possible futures are and following through with what, based on our experience and the best research so far, we might expect the consequences to be. Based on those, we can think about how we might be impacted and therefore respond. So with my colleagues here at Carleton, at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, and IISD, we've been working with OMAFRA, regional conservation authorities, local agronomists, and farmers to improve a tool that was previously released by a project called Farms to Regions. Some of you were involved in that one as well, and I'll talk briefly about it in a minute. And so these improvements, these additions that we've been making have been done in the last few years by pulling in locally relevant information that is specifically focused on the impacts of extreme events, of the impacts of extreme weather shifts. So we need to document that. We have documented that weather pressures on agriculture are shifting, and later you'll hear on more about what that has meant for agriculture, including explanation of the seasonal phenology-based indices that is referred to on this slide, and more general resilience indices with broader relevance as well. We also realize that anybody that's trying to make sense of these questions at a relatively local level can quickly be bombarded with a huge mix of uncertainty, technological jargon, data sets that don't play nicely together, and so on. So a big part of what we've been trying to do is talk with a broad range of people to look for ways we might be able to contribute to more relevant more relevant data sets, indicators, and in general communication between those that study climate change on its own and its impacts on communities and operations on the other side. So, a little bit more about the project that led into this. The Farms to Regions project involved extensive consultation to identify what scenarios are relevant for assessing adaptation options in this region. It built the first version of the scenario assessment tool that we've continued to work on and with in this project. I won't go into too much detail of that project beyond this slide and the next, but reports and briefing notes from that project are available on our website. The URL for the website is at the bottom of this slide, and it comes up again at the end of this presentation. So this is a systems diagram that was developed during the Farms to Region project, and it was an attempt to capture what are the relevant drivers and related factors, concentrating on, but not being completely exclusive to, agricultural systems in Eastern Ontario. We've maintained a lot of that focus in the work we'll talk about today in this project, in that we've concentrated much of our efforts on improving and adding in detail to this food and feed box in the middle of the figure, and also the land use change and diversification box. But we've also spent a lot of time working on the sort of the climate driver box within this system diagram, and of course that has implications throughout the system. Okay, and my next, why are we doing this slide? Why extremes? Why focusing on extremes? That's because from the start of this project, we realized that a lot of the work on the likely impacts of climate change on agriculture tends to focus on changes to really integrative measures of weather, like averages and sums. And that can present a really rosy picture. So, for example, the graphs on this slide, if you concentrate on very integrative measures like growing season length and total annual energy available to crops, represented here as crop heat units, then recent trends look pretty good. You see a growing season getting longer in the top graph, and the heat units, or the energy that's available for photosynthesis in the plants, just keeps going up. But changes to averages and sums are not all that has been happening, nor is it likely to continue happening. So we wanted to focus on the impacts of changing extremes. That's a lot more complicated, and yes, it does mean that there's more uncertainty involved, but we wanted to see what we could pull out. So next slide, sorry, I forgot to say when I'm changing slides, but I'm on slide 6, why focus on scenarios and indicators and phenological impacts. So why the scenarios and indicators first? Well, we're pulling in forecasts of what future climates may be based on GCMs, or general circulation models, or global climate models, depending on who you ask. And every GCM run is a scenario, not a prediction itself. And it's hard to justify layering a single prediction of any specific ecosystem response on top of that, particularly amidst a range of possible assumptions about reactions and possible adaptation from all the ecosystem components, including the humans. We also know that the global climate models lack spatial and temporal detail in their outputs, at least with respect to information that is relevant to a lot of regional evaluations of risk and potential trade-offs. And there can be very high uncertainties if you try to go from the coarser resolutions of the GCMs down to finer resolutions in space and time. This typically requires a lot of assumptions and potentially very high data needs. You can't confidently fill all those needs with data, but you can explore a likely range of future conditions with confidence and consider different sets of likely parameters under scenarios that explore what our future options could be. So that's why the emphasis on scenarios. And similarly, when you're looking on at how you could address the impacts, a lot of approaches get into crop modeling, and there's a lot of really good uses for crop models, but for the kinds of questions we wanted to answer, we recognize that a lot of approaches to crop modeling focuses on usually looking at yield, and they use either a process-based approach, which means you have very high uncertainty if you're trying to parameterize across very large regions, but more confidence in the responses under new conditions, or empirical models where you're usually assuming the same conditions will apply everywhere in time and space. In other words, the assumptions of the statistical models include stationarity, meaning that all the parameterization that you're given your model right now will remain valid in the future in different contexts. So by instead concentrating on the impacts of specific weather patterns with respect to the development stages of crops, that's what we mean by phenological impacts, we can look at what are the relative impacts on farming operations under different scenario and landscape contexts without getting bogged down in the uncertainty of detailed process modeling. So that's what we will be talking about mostly today. We're concentrating on the phenological impacts, which means it's the intersection of the weather that's occurring at different times with agricultural operations and crops that are at different growth stages. Okay, so hopefully that's clear and sets the context for the rest of the presentations today. All this work was conducted in Eastern Ontario. The analysis of weather trends in the past and the collection of data sets, both past and future forecasts, have been done and are being made available across Eastern Ontario as pictured here. You'll see that in future presentations that our actual scenario modeling framework that we're using uses a subset of this area that concentrates on just 3 municipalities that are the ones that are more agriculturally dominated in the east of this map. What have we done in the last 3 years, and how are we sharing it all? That's really set out by the presentations you'll see today. So this slide is actually really just an outline of the presentations that we're going to have. The first activity, which took up most of our time in the first year of the project, was very important background work for all the other stuff, but isn't terribly exciting unless you're really into data sets, statistics, and things like spatial interpolation and downscaling. So we won't talk about it a lot today. It'll be more, except to say that there will be more on this at the follow-up webinar in late July. I think it's July 26th. And we'll be documenting all our findings and decisions that we made. That's a big part of what we are going to be sharing through our web portal. We will hear about the improvements that were made to what we're calling the farm model. Dan McDonald will be presenting on that in a couple minutes. Tanya Tanner will talk about her work looking at the farm types in the region and how farm types change, what are the trends through time, and also that involves changes to farm size and field sizes. Anya has prepared a presentation, which probably I will be giving because she's sick, on the crop-specific indicators that I've alluded to just a minute ago. And Lizia Bizakova will be presenting on more general resilience indicators. And then the other big activity, of course, is getting this out to everyone, and that involves what we're doing here today as well as what's being made available on the web. I said I wouldn't talk too much about the initial data assessments, but if you'll bear with me quickly, I'll just try and summarize the kinds of issues that this work faces. A lot of it has to do with the challenges in making sense of both the known information about what the weather has been in the past and predictions of what might happen under different scenarios in the future when you're trying to figure out what it means for people and processes at specific places on the planet. So a lot of this is available, for example, at a weather station or at large grid cells that are regularly placed across a region. And then there are challenges, to say it very simply, there are challenges trying to figure out how do you translate that to other places within the region, or how, can you pull out any finer spatial detail and temporal detail. I can't say that we resolved all the challenges, but we've explored this a lot of different ways, and so part of what we want to share is why we've chosen the compromises that we chose, what the implications of that are, and make those data sets and the reprocessed data sets that we had made available for other people, along with documentation of what they can expect to maybe be able to do or not do with that data. Another point is that we decided to concentrate on extreme weather. Well, whether you're trying to concentrate on what has happened at a specific location in space or a limited window in time, like a specific storm event, if that's a limited window in time, right? Or individual predictions of future processes, you're often, well, in any of those cases, you're setting up a pretty specific context, which means you're probably going to miss out on all the other possibilities that could happen in the future. Global climate modelers typically deal with this problem by looking at the range of predictions from a whole bunch of different models. And that's a great way to not, be blinded by the assumptions that are in a specific model. But when you look at that range, what you're really looking at is an assessment of the uncertainty in the models, not about the normal variability in time and space that affects farm scale or local community planning. Okay, so at the same time, if you're a local community or agricultural organization trying to make sense of all these data sets, well, you've got a lot of problems if you're trying to make all your decisions based on broader scale inputs. And so we've been trying to look at what is available to scale things down to make it relevant to local planning, and what are the problems that you run into. But then the flip side of that is what can you save? What can you still do with that kind of information? So as I said, sharing what we found did work and didn't work is a big part of what we want to do. I keep mentioning this decision support framework, and what is this? So this is a screenshot of one view of our scenario modeling framework. Sorry, people that don't have video, I'm now on slide 10, labeled Envision, Scenario Exploration Framework. This is built within a more general spatial scenario exploration environment called Envision, which is an open source project out of Oregon State University, and it combines an agent-based decision modeling framework or environment with spatial databases and a growing library of plugins that simulate or calculate different aspects of what's happening across that landscape. So our predecessor, the Fields to Region project, used some of the existing plugins and scenario definition tools provided by the Envision project, and it commissioned the programming of some other existing relevant models, converting them into plugins for Envision as well. So this project over the last 3 years concentrated on developing new custom modules that would better simulate climate impacts and agricultural processes in this area. This Envision environment allows us to intersect the climate information, either historical data from either historical data or forecasts from climate models, with a distribution of farms and communities on the landscape. Now, what do I mean by that? Dan will explain it in more detail with figures, but it's pretty much about taking data about what existed in this region at a specific point in time to create a realistic but synthetic landscape that then can be projected through future scenarios. These scenarios include the regionally relevant ones developed through the Farms to Regions projects about likely trajectories in the future here, and also future climate scenarios, which we've now updated to the IPCC AR5 suite of GCM predictions, concentrating on a subset of them that have been documented by others to be the best ones for representing the extremes. While it's going through these scenarios, it tracks what the weather will mean for each farm field, constrained by the farm operation logic that Dan will talk about next, and evaluates impacts on crops that are planted on a field-by-field basis, using the research conducted by Anna in consultation with others. And while we're processing that stream of weather data, whether it's projected or observed, we also calculate many of the resilience indicators that Livia will be talking about. So then for dissemination, again, there's the URL to our website, all our data sets, the links to the Envision modeling framework, the processing tools that we use to create the data sets, and the documentation for all of this is being wrapped up now and made available through our web portal. Today's webinar, getting the overview of our work, as well as the one for July 26th, that'll concentrate more on the data set and algorithm development. We went through, they're all being recorded, and those recordings will also be made available at this site.